Our guest today is best served by an introduction that is quick and gets out of the way as soon as possible. But I do want to mention a few things about our guest. Terry Teachout is the drama critic and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and the cultural critic for Commentary magazine. He's the author of several books on the topics of H.L. Mencken, George Balanchine, and most recently a very celebrated biography of Louis Armstrong, a book that was praised by outlets such as The Washington Post and The Economist as one of the best books of 2009. He was the first major art journalist in the United States to take up blogging, which he does avidly, and he's been somewhat of a vanguard in this field. He's a playwright as well, transforming his Armstrong biography into a play entitled Satchmo at the Waldorf, which will be staged this summer by Shakespeare and Company in Lenox, Massachusetts. He has written opera libretti. His opera, The Letter, opened at the Santa Fe Opera in 2009, and his opera Danse Russe, which is a comedy about the writing of The Rite of Spring, premiered in Philadelphia in 2011. He's a former member of the National Council for the Arts, the steering committee for the NEA, and at one time was a working jazz musician in Kansas City. So, that having been put on the table, please welcome Terry Teachout.
And I tweet. And if any of you follow me, you know I've been having a good time at Baylor for the last couple of days. I'm glad you're here. I'm very glad to be talking to you about a book that is more than usually near and dear to my heart. The reason is the subject, who was near and dear to countless hearts, and still is. Over the years, I've spoken to many people who knew Louis Armstrong, and they have all told me the same thing, that he was a truly lovable man. Now, I've spent most of my life in the company of artists, and one thing I can tell you is that the greatest ones tend not to be especially lovable. Likeable, yes, sometimes. Charismatic, yes, sometimes. And not infrequently irresistible, for it's part of human nature for us ordinary people to want to warm our hands at the fire of a great creator. But those fires are very hot indeed, and I've known any number of people who got badly burned as a result of keeping company with greatness. Well, Louis Armstrong was different. He was a great man who was also a good man, kind and generous and considerate. He was utterly unpretentious. He didn't talk in pompous cliches. He loved to laugh and knew how to make other people laugh. And, on top of all that, he was the greatest jazz musician who ever lived. Armstrong was one of the cultural giants of the 20th century. America has never produced a more significant artist. I rank him right alongside Aaron Copland and Robert Frost and Frank Lloyd Wright. But unlike those men, he was also a great entertainer whose music was and is loved by ordinary people all over the world. In 1964, he actually knocked the Beatles off the top of the pop charts with his recording of Hello, Dolly. Aaron Copland never did that. So you can see why I was drawn to the writing of a biography of so singular a creature as Satchmo, or Pops, as his friends called him, and is the title of my book. Now, I'm not the first person ever to have written a book about Louis Armstrong, but I am the first biographer to have had access to 650 reel-to-reel tapes that Armstrong made during the last quarter century of his life, many of which contain astonishingly candid recordings of his private after-hours conversations. Armstrong switched on his tape recorder whenever the spirit moved him. You can hear him chatting with friends over dinner, getting high with an old pal in his dressing room after a show, even trying to coax his wife into bed at 5 a.m. for a little hanky-panky. The existence of these tapes was a big part of what made me want to write Pops. Now, nowadays, most folks know me as a drama critic, but as David alluded, I'm also a trained musician. I am, in fact, the first trained musician ever to have written a fully sourced Louis Armstrong biography. I started out as a professional jazz musician. I was a bass player before I became a full-time writer. That experience has helped me, I think, to understand Armstrong's music and the world in which he lived and worked from the inside out. In Pops, I tried to translate that knowledge into plain English and weave it into the incredible story of Armstrong's life. As Duke Ellington said, he was born poor, died rich, and never hurt anyone on the way. But how did he work that miracle? In the course of writing Pops, I came to feel that Armstrong's triumph was as much a function of his personality as of his musical genius. And that personality was far more complex than most people realize. If you don't understand the one, you won't understand the other. And it's Armstrong's personality to which I want to introduce you now. So let's start in the very best possible way by watching him at work. What you are about to see is an excerpt from the earliest surviving film of Louis Armstrong performing on stage. It was shot in Copenhagen in 1933. He is singing and playing a song called Dinah with a band of musicians from Europe. Would you play the video, please?
The next number we're going to swing for you is one of the good old favorites. That's Dinah, Dinah. Look out there, boy. Are you ready? Look out. Is anyone finer in the state of Carolina? If there is, then you know, show to me, Dinah, the Teachout blazing, love the city gazing to the eyes of Dinah, me. Baby, every night, one eye, shake my fat palm, cut my dynamite, change your mind, Bobby, did you need? Don't you want to do China, baby? I'll have a Dinah, oh, baby. Oh, Dinah, Dinah. Oh, Dinah, oh, baby, Dinah, Dinah, oh, baby, every night, when I, oh, that's me. If you want to do that, baby, I'd have an old yeah.
Now, to me as a biographer, that film is priceless for all sorts of reasons. One of them is that it bears out everything that the European critics wrote about what Armstrong was like on stage in 1933. Detail for detail, point by point, they all talk about how he moved around the stage like a panther. I mean, even little things, like whenever he introduced a song, he'd always say the title twice. He'd say, Dinah, Dinah. But to me, one of the most illuminating things about this piece of film is that the second he puts the trumpet to his mouth, everything changes. The body becomes still, he locks into position. It's as though he's turned off the entertainer switch and turned on the genius switch. And you can say that, you can see it written down, but to actually see it, well, for somebody like me who is not old enough to have known Armstrong and who never saw him perform on stage, a piece of film like that really does say more than 1,000 words, more like 10,000 words. That is the Louis Armstrong who took the world by storm in the 20s and 30s, the public Armstrong. But in my book, I also take you backstage to meet the private Armstrong, because even though he was known all over the world for that million-volt smile, Louis Armstrong was a tough-minded, realistic man who always knew the score, whether it was about race relations or the music business or anything else. He loved to tell tales about his life, and he told them very, very well, because he was not just a gifted musician, but a gifted writer. Tallulah Bankhead, who was one of his biggest fans, said that Armstrong uses words like he strings notes together, artistically and vividly. Armstrong wrote beautifully about his life. He actually left behind a biography, Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, which he wrote without a ghostwriter, written completely unassisted. But of course, his real autobiography is his music. Joe Glazer, his manager, once said that Armstrong was a real man. He reminds me of something that my namesake, the Roman playwright Terence, wrote 2,000 years ago. I am a man and nothing is alien to me. Louis Armstrong was a real man and nothing was alien to him, and he turned it all, good and bad, into music. Now, it goes without saying, or it should, that Louis Armstrong's music was the most important thing about him. Yet his personal story, in addition to shedding light on the wellsprings of his art, is important in its own right and no less in need of a historically aware interpretation. To understand him now, we must see him as he was, a black man born at the turn of the century in the poorest quarter of New Orleans, who by the end of his life was known and loved in every corner of the earth. What manner of man succeeded in making so amazing a journey? How did he rise above the unforgiving circumstances of his birth to become a culture-shaping giant? And what marks did these circumstances leave on him? Now, everyone who knew Armstrong agreed that he was just what he seemed to be. Joe Muraney, who played clarinet in his band, the All-Stars, said to me, "What you saw was what you got." And it was his genuineness as much as his genius to which his fans responded. Jack Bradley, a photographer whom Armstrong befriended in the 60s, described him to me as down-to-earth, natural, completely unpretentious, simple in the best sense of the word. It was his genuineness as much as his genius to which his fans responded. Once, and this is a true story, he reacted to a radio interviewer's pronouncement that he was a living American legend by undoing his belt and dropping his pants and giggling. He said on another occasion, "I don't care what company I'm in, what environment, you know. I just want to be there and enjoy it. I'm just as good as the average cat." Whether on stage or off, he was the embodiment of Johnny Mercer's admonition in his song, "Accentuate the Positive." You've got to spread joy up to the maximum, keep gloom down to the minimum. Danny Barker, the New Orleans guitarist, saw Armstrong in his dressing room after a show, and he remembered the sight ever after. This is what he said. He'd be sitting down in his underwear with a towel around his lap, one around his shoulders, and that white handkerchief on his head, and he'd put that grease around his lips, look like a minstrel man, you know, and laughing, you know, natural, the way he is. And in the room, you see maybe two nuns. You see a streetwalker dressed all up in flaming clothes. You see maybe a guy come out of a penitentiary. You see maybe a blind man sitting there. You see a rabbi. You see a priest. You're liable to see maybe two policemen or detectives. You see a judge. All of them different levels of society in the dressing room, and he's talking to all of them. And there'd be some kids there, white and colored. All the diverse people of different social levels, and everybody's looking. Got their eyes dead on him, just like they were looking at a diamond. Well, Armstrong was, of course, the least average of cats. though his place in the history of jazz is harder to explain than is commonly understood. Louis Armstrong did not invent jazz, nor was he its first significant figure. And it's not even right to call him the first great jazz soloist, as many critics and scholars have done. Sidney Bechet, the New Orleans clarinetist who was 4 years his senior, preceded him by a full decade, and Bix Beiderbecke started winning national recognition at the same time as Armstrong, almost to the month, in 1924. So what was it that made Louis Armstrong stand out? And why is his name still known to those who know nothing else about jazz? The simplest explanation, and up to a point, the best one, is that he was the first great influence in jazz. No sooner did he burst upon the scene than other musicians, trumpeters, saxophonists, singers started to imitate him. Rex Stewart, who replaced him in Fletcher Henderson's band, said, "I tried to walk like him, talk like him, eat like him, sleep like him." Coleman Hawkins, Henderson's star saxophonist, heard him for the first time in 1924, and he was stunned into speechlessness. He remembered, "I stood silent, feeling almost bashful, asking myself if I would ever be able to attain a small part of Louis Armstrong's greatness." The trumpeter Max Kaminsky told of how the combination of Louis's dazzling virtuosity and sensational brilliance of tone so overwhelmed me that I felt as if I had stared into the sun's eye. Such imagery came easily to those who heard Armstrong in his halcyon days. The poet Philip Larkin, a part-time jazz critic and lifelong Armstrong fan, praised him in similar terms, calling him something inexhaustible and unchanging like the sun. What spoke to these artists, as it speaks to all those hearing Armstrong for the first time, is the combination of hurtling momentum and expansive lyricism that propelled his playing and singing alike. Now, we all know about the momentum, what jazz musicians call swing and time. When it comes to jazz, Armstrong was Father Time, and the 4 staccato quarter notes that he raps out at the start of West End Blues, his most celebrated recording, proclaimed the coming of a new way of thinking about rhythm. Though the passage looks innocuous on paper, it catapulted his fellow jazzmen into a musical world in which even the simplest of phrases were charged with an irresistible forward thrust. The bold rhythmic impetus of that cadenza changed the sound of jazz. It springs forward like a panther. Yet Armstrong's internal metronome was exact enough to impress the most fanatically rhythmic of classical musicians. Herbert von Karajan once told the members of the Vienna Philharmonic that he was going to an all-star concert. He said, "Imagine 2 hours of music, and not once will it slow down or speed up by mistake." But Armstrong could also toy with time. He could stretch it this way and that, the way he does in the serene trumpet solo that ends his 1933 recording of Harold Arlen's "I Got a Right to Sing the Blues." It's my favorite Armstrong recording, my favorite Armstrong solo. You can hear him hovering miles above the clockwork tyranny of the 1-2-3-4 beat and sounding for all the world like a lordly turn-of-the-century grand opera tenor in full cry. Well, now that wasn't a coincidence, because Louis Armstrong liked, listened to, and learned from opera. He said, "I like that deep stuff. It gasses me no end." Late in life, he remembered buying his first record player, a wind-up Victrola, as a teenager in New Orleans, and he recalled, "Most of my records were the original Dixieland Jazz Band, but I had Caruso, too, and Gallicorci, Tetrazzini. They were all my favorites. And then there was that Irish tenor, John McCormick. Beautiful phrasing." But his style was also permeated with the rough beauty of the blues. And if it was his way to sing and play the blues with a smile, he knew as well as anyone that the world of which he sang could be a hurtful place. He said once, "When I play back-of-town blues, I'm thinking about one of those old low-down moments when maybe your woman didn't treat you right. It's a hell of a moment when a woman tell you, 'I got another mule in my stall.'" Even the classical melodies that Louis Armstrong loved took on a new tint when they were passed through the prism of his vast experience. He said, "I seen everything from a child coming up. Nothing happened I ain't never seen before." He was forever reflecting on the things he had seen, sometimes on paper, but more often with his horn. He said, "When I blow, I think of times and things from out of the past that gives me an image of the tune, like moving pictures passing in front of my eyes, a town, a chick somewhere back down the line, an old man with no name you seen once in a place you don't remember." That was why he never used musical terminology when he was talking about his music, because it was all about life. These are but a few of the myriad facets of Armstrong's art, and you can go a long way toward understanding him without mentioning anything else. But it's just not enough to say that he was a phenomenally gifted and imaginative artist and let it go at that. The other reason why he cast so long a shadow is that his personality, as I said a moment ago, was as compelling as his artistry. In fact, the two could not be separated because his lavish generosity of spirit was part and parcel of his prodigal way of making music. Even in his old age, he held nothing back, and it seemed at times that nothing was beyond him. He really did perform with everyone from Leonard Bernstein to Johnny Cash. He really did end his concerts, some of them anyway, by playing 250 or more high Cs, capped with a high F. He wrote Satchmo, My Life in New Orleans, without a collaborator. The ranks of his admirers included people like Kingsley Amis, Jackson Pollock, Jean Renoir, Le Corbusier. Virgil Thompson, the composer, called him a master of musical art. Stuart Davis, whose abstract paintings were full of jazz-inspired images, cited him as a model of greatness. Is it any wonder, then, that so many musicians longed to play the way that Louis Armstrong played and sing the way he sang? It was no accident that they usually referred to him not as Satchmo, which was his own favorite nickname, but as Pops, because he was the father figure of jazz, and what his children wanted was to be him, or at least come as close as they possibly could. For all his directness, Armstrong was in no way a simple person. He was a man of boundless generosity who preached the stony gospel of individual responsibility. A ferociously ambitious artist who preferred, when he could, to do as he was told. An introspective man who, as you saw a moment ago, exploded with irrepressible vitality whenever he stepped into the spotlight. A joyous genius who confounded his critics by refusing to distinguish between making art and making fun. No more than any other genius was he all of a piece. Yet all was resolved each time he raised his trumpet to his lips, for that was when the laughter stopped and the beauty began. He knew, as he said once, that showmanship does not mean you're not serious. And no one who has read his writings can doubt that he was both serious and self-aware. He knew who he was. He knew what he had done. He knew how far he had come, and he was fiercely proud of it all. He admitted once that his music mattered more to him than anything else, even his wives. He said, "When I pick up that horn, that's all. The world's behind me, and I don't concentrate on nothing but it. That's my living and my life. I love them notes. That's why I try to make them right. You see?" Well, the whole world saw and heard. Now, a few words of epilogue. I spent 5 years working on Pops, A Life of Louis Armstrong. And since then, a great many people have asked me something like this. They say, "That's a long time to spend with anybody. Do you still like Armstrong? Do you still admire him? Or did you get sick and tired of him?" Well, that's an easy question to answer. I didn't get sick or tired of Louis Armstrong, and truth to tell, I don't see how you could. Because he is that rarity of rarities, a great man who improves with exposure. The better you get to know him, the more you like him. This isn't to say that he wasn't a complicated personality, because he was, very much so. Off stage, he could be moody and profane. He had a habit of flying into red rages that he forgot all about the next day, and he knew how to hold a grudge. But that's merely to say that Armstrong was a human being, as flawed as the next man. And if there's anything that I learned in the process of writing Pops, it is that Louis Armstrong's flaws were few and forgivable. In return for his unswerving dedication to his art, he knew true happiness, and he shared it unstintingly with his fellow men. Not long before he died, he said to a friend, "My whole life has been happiness. Through all the misfortunes, I didn't plan anything. Life was there for me, and I accepted. And life, whatever came out, has been beautiful to me, and I love everybody." One of his favorite songs, and one whose lyrics summed up his philosophy of life, was "On the Sunny Side of the Street." That was the side of the street he walked his whole life long. Dorothy Fields wrote the words, and they could easily serve as Louis Armstrong's epitaph. Grab your coat and get your hat. Leave your worries on the doorstep. Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street. I can't top that, so I will let Pops himself have the very last word. What you're about to see is a TV performance of On the Sunny Side of the Street, originally telecast in 1958. It is my favorite film clip of Louis Armstrong, the one that says the most about who he was and what he did. Take it away, Satch.